Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling episode of our scary stories. I'm your host, lurking in the shadows of your deepest fears, waiting to enthrall you with tales of the macabre and the mysterious. Tonight, prepare to journey through time to a village steeped in suspicion, a community teetering on the edge of reason, all the while blissfully ignorant of the malevolent force that lurks among them. The air is thick with dread, the winds whisper sinister secrets, and the land itself seems to quake in terror. Are you ready? Turn off the lights, clutch your amulets tight, and let's descend into the season of the witch. The village of Marrowvale lay ensconced in rolling hills, the cottages made of weathered stone, each one clustered around the spine of the land like bony vertebrae. It was the type of village where everyone knew your name and your sins. Each morning, men and women plied their trades with well-worn hands, tilling the stubborn earth and sewing garments by dim candlelight. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, the scriptures, and an unspoken social code that hung in the air as thick as the scent of freshly turned soil. But lately, the earth had been less forgiving. Fields that should have yielded abundant harvests brought forth shriveled corn and hollow gourds. Livestock grew gaunt and listless. And the skies, they churned in strange hues, not just the soft oranges and blues of dawn, but sometimes an eerie green, as if the heavens themselves had turned ill. In the center of the village, adjacent to the imposing stone church, villagers gathered in the worn meeting hall. Wood planks creaked as the community filed in, each face etched with worry, framed by the flickering light of wall-mounted lanterns. Henry, the blacksmith, and a man of some authority, stood. Fellow villagers, we've come to discuss the cursed blight that afflicts us. Our very livelihoods hang in the balance. It was young Thomas, a boy of no more than 10, who shattered the uneasy silence next. I saw it, he stammered. In the woods, a demon dancing amongst the trees. It had horns, and his words dropped like stones into a pond, rippling through the assembled crowd. At that moment, the room felt colder, as if the walls had sucked in a wintry breath. From her seat in the back, Agnes, a widow and the oldest in the village, stood with some effort. I recall stories of witches and wicked entities, things our grandparents told us. They might not be mere tales. Perhaps what young Thomas saw was enough. Father Edmund, the local priest, his voice tinged with severity, intervened. We must not let fear get the best of us. Surely there's a logical explanation. Just then, Morgana, appearing as nothing more than a humble herb woman, emerged from the shadowed corners of the hall. Her eyes gleamed like a cat's in the muted light. Perhaps some protection is in order, she said, her voice soft but surprisingly clear. I have charms, blessed by the old ways. They ward off evil. People were desperate, and desperation makes for easy prey. A queue quickly formed as Morgana exchanged small, woven talismans for whatever coins or barter the villagers could afford. Nobody noticed her sly smile, or the way her eyes lingered on the nervous assembly as if scanning the tapestry of their collective fears. With each exchange, her satchel grew heavier with trinkets and rare herbs, each one a subtle component for her impending ritual. Whispers started to circulate, tinged with mistrust. Bartholomew, the innkeeper, who was a foreigner and had a strange accent, drew suspicious glances. Sarah, a young woman known for her love of solitary walks in the woods, now became the subject of hushed conversations. I've never trusted Bartholomew. Where's he from, anyway? Richard, the miller, his voice tremulous, inquired as he clenched his new charm. And Sarah was gathering herbs near the forest edge last week, was she not? Mary, a baker's wife, added, her eyes narrowing. As Morgana took note of their heightened suspicions, she reveled in the invisible yet overwhelming scent of dread that seemed to saturate the room, almost like incense in a twisted sanctuary. Every pointed finger, every accusatory glance was another ingredient, a catalyst, for the darker work that lay ahead. For all their fear of the supernatural, the villagers of Marrowvale didn't realize they had just invited the very source of their nightmares into their midst. Underneath her placid exterior, Morgana felt like a spider at the center of a web, each thread vibrating with delicious tension. And so, as the meeting adjourned, the people of Marrowvale went back to their stone homes, clutching their new charms like lifelines, completely unaware that the seeds of their own destruction had just been sown, germinating in the very soil of their deepest fears. Little did they know that the season of the witch had only just begun. The sky hung low over Marrowvale, oppressive and gray, as if the very heavens were bearing witness to the tensions that boiled below. The trees bordering the village seemed to huddle together, their leaves dark and still, as though they too were spectators of the impending drama. Villagers gathered in the main square, right in front of the imposing wooden platform that served as the stage for public announcements, and, on darker occasions, public punishments. Murmurs and whispers unfurled like tendrils of mist, creating an atmosphere of dread and anticipation. Richard, the miller, was the first to break the silence, his voice quivering like a leaf in the wind. "We cannot allow this wickedness to fester." Sarah was seen near the woods with strange herbs and symbols. His words were met with a smattering of murmurs, nods, and even a few shouts of agreement. The crowd's tension escalated, like a pot of water teetering on the edge of a rolling boil. Father Edmund stepped onto the platform, Bible in hand, his eyes scanning the crowd before finally settling on Sarah. Her face was as pale as milk, and her hands were bound tightly with coarse rope. "Sarah, you stand accused of witchcraft. What say you in your defense?" Sarah's eyes darted around the square, meeting those of her accusers, her neighbors, her friends. "I am no witch," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have lived among you all my life. How can you believe such things of me?" Henry, the blacksmith, cleared his throat, his voice laden with grim authority. "If she's innocent, she has nothing to fear. The trial will reveal the truth." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd as Morgana, still donning her guise as a simple herb woman, unveiled a piece of fabric tightly wrapped around a bundle of peculiar herbs and a crudely drawn pentacle, items she had secretly planted among Sarah's possessions. Father Edmund took a deep breath. "Given this evidence, and lacking any other explanation, we must proceed with grim duty. Sarah, you are hereby sentenced to hang for the practice of witchcraft." The crowd's reaction was a mix of gasps, sobs, and a few murmurs of agreement. Lines were drawn, relationships strained and broken, as neighbors turned against neighbors, and even families became divided. In that moment, Marrowvale was a village no longer united but fractured, a mirror shattered into countless jagged shards. As dusk fell and the villagers dispersed, Morgana found her way to a secluded glade deep within the forest. The setting sun cast elongated shadows among the trees, as if stretching their gnarled arms in anticipation. She placed her satchel on a flat stone and carefully arranged her ritual ingredients, the herbs and trinkets she had gathered, a vial of raven's blood, and a shard of obsidian. As she chanted words in an ancient language, long forgotten by all but those who walked hidden paths, the forest seemed to hum in response, vibrating with an energy as old as the earth. Invisible waves of chaos and dread rippled out from Morgana, amplified by the fear and discord that had consumed the village. Each utterance, each gesture fed into her dark tapestry, weaving an incantation that drew upon the communal hysteria as though it were fuel for her eldritch fire. As Morgana completed the first part of her ritual, a chill wind swept through the forest, causing the trees to shudder as if whispering secrets to one another. In the distance, a wolf howled, its mournful cry reverberating through the night, as if heralding the dark events yet to come. Morgana carefully repacked her satchel and made her way back toward the village, her footsteps light, almost as if she were gliding over the forest floor. As she emerged from the trees, Marrowvale lay before her, its stone cottages appearing innocent and tranquil under the silvery moonlight, their occupants none the wiser to the dread she had unleashed. The stage was set, the players unwitting, and Morgana felt a thrill of anticipation, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat in a sinister symphony. And so, as night settled over Marrowvale, the flickering lanterns casting shadows that danced like restless spirits, an eerie sense of foreboding filled the air. Yet even as they locked their doors and said their prayers, the villagers could not shake the feeling that something terrible had been set in motion, a malevolent force that could not be undone. The sun rose reluctantly over Marrowvale, casting a feeble light that seemed almost apologetic, as though it too sensed the dark cloud that had settled over the village. Emma, a farmer's wife, ventured into her fields and found her crops unnaturally wilted, as if drained of life overnight. A mournful lowing echoed from the cattle pens, the animals restless, their eyes almost human in their anguish. The strangeness extended its invisible fingers into every facet of life in Marrowvale. Chickens refused to lay eggs, and the waters of the river ran murkier than anyone could remember. A chilling unease stitched itself into the very fabric of the community, a psychological fog that was as inescapable as it was inexplicable. By midday, the village square filled once more, its residents anxious for answers, for assurance, for salvation. Father Edmund ascended the wooden platform, his robe more disheveled than usual, dark bags hanging under his eyes. He raised his hands for silence, but his gaze was distant, almost fearful. "Brethren, we are being tested," he began, voice tinged with an unsettling fervor. "The heavens are sending us signs. Let us fall on our knees and pray for deliverance." His words resonated with the villagers, whose hearts were already primed by dread and superstition. Heads bowed, lips moved in whispered prayer, each soul desperately bargaining for divine intervention. It was at this moment that Agnes, the elder who had spoken of witches in the earlier meeting, pointed an arthritic finger at Henry. "He's the cause of this. I saw him wandering near the woods last night." Henry, eyes wide with disbelief, stepped forward. "I've done nothing. You accuse me because you need a scapegoat for your fears." But the crowd was like a wounded animal, dangerous and unpredictable. A mood shifted like quicksand, swallowing Henry's protests with an indignant roar. Morgana seized the opportunity, her heart pounding with anticipation. She approached Henry under the guise of comforting him, slipping a small, carved talisman into his coat pocket. An artifact so sinister, so evidently tied to forbidden practices, that it would condemn him without question. Soon enough, the talisman was discovered, and the already nervous crowd erupted into shouts of condemnation. Father Edmund, caught in the riptide of collective hysteria, pronounced the grim sentence: "Henry, you shall hang at dawn." That evening, Morgana returned to her secluded forest glade, a place that had become a sanctuary of dark purpose. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, painting the ground in a mosaic of light and shadow. She placed a wooden effigy at the center of her makeshift altar, an object that symbolized the life of Henry, soon to be forfeit. Around the effigy, she arranged stones in a circle, each one etched with runes that shimmered in an otherworldly glow. Then she drew a ritual dagger, its blade curved like a crescent moon, and sliced her palm, letting her blood drip onto the effigy. She began to chant, her voice mingling with the whispers of the wind, the creaking of the trees, the nocturnal chorus of creatures hidden in the dark. Each verse of her incantation pulsed through the ground, as if the earth itself were listening. Morgana could feel the ritual absorbing the essence of the villagers' fear, and discord growing stronger, ever closer to the terrible crescendo that would shatter the walls between worlds. As she completed the second part of her ritual, the air seemed to thicken, and the wind died down, as if the very elements were holding their breath. The sky seemed darker, the stars dimmed as though veiled by an invisible hand. With her ritual complete, Morgana packed away her tools and returned to the village. Marrowvale seemed to be holding its collective breath, trapped in a liminal state between day and night, between hope and despair, between life as it had always been and the unknowable dark fate that loomed ever closer. And as she approached the stone cottages of the village, Morgana couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of elation. Every cry of grief, every whispered prayer, every aching heart was another step on the path she had so meticulously laid out. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another hanging, another crack in the facade of this mortal world. And Morgana couldn't help but wonder, with a kind of malevolent curiosity, just how much further the villagers could be pushed before everything they knew shattered into oblivion. The sun that rose over Marrowvale seemed less a harbinger of light than a fading ember, a weakened glow that barely dispelled the night's coldness. The village was changing, its transformation subtle yet pervasive, like rust corrupting iron or mold spoiling bread. Families, once close-knit, exchanged mistrustful glances over their shared fences. Conversations, once hearty and cheerful, now treaded lightly, filled with veiled insinuations and awkward silences. John, a carpenter, eyed his lifelong friend Mark with suspicion. The two had been inseparable since childhood, but now every laugh, every pat on the back, felt like a potential betrayal. "It's like we're all cursed," Mark said, staring into his ale as though expecting it to reveal some hidden truth. "Aye, perhaps we are," John replied, not looking up, his mind awash with apprehensions. And then, as if on cue, a new tribulation gripped the village, a mysterious sickness. Villagers began falling ill, their symptoms unsettlingly vague yet debilitating. Fevers, shakes, hallucinations. It was as if an unseen hand was reaching inside them, grasping at their vitality. A local apothecary, overwhelmed and confused, could only offer rudimentary potions, herbs, and prayers. Amid the escalating calamity, horse hooves clattered in the distance. Dust and dread swirled in the air as a troop of officials clad in the somber uniform of the Inquisition arrived. "We are here to root out the evil plaguing this community," their leader, Inquisitor Lambert, announced, his eyes not betraying an ounce of emotion. Morgana watched, her fingers lightly grazing a pouch of dried herbs hanging from her waist. The arrival of the Inquisition would only serve her plans, accelerating the spiral of chaos and despair. As the Inquisitors made themselves at home, appropriating the village hall as their base, 2 more villagers, Helen and Robert, were arrested. They were the easiest to blame, Helen because of her keen knowledge of herbs, Robert because of his reclusive nature. The subsequent trials were swift, almost perfunctory, as if the judgments had been rendered before they even began. Both were found guilty and executed, their screams of innocence swallowed by the mob's cries for justice. For Morgana, the moment was ripe to seek the final ingredient for her ritual, a tear from an innocent. She found her opportunity in young Thomas, who was already on edge from the unraveling of his community. Conveniently offering herself as a source of comfort to the distraught child, she pulled him aside. "It will be all right, Thomas," she whispered, her words a soft caress. "But why are they taking everyone away?" Thomas choked, his eyes misting over. "Nothing to worry about, my boy." Morgana cooed, capturing his tear with a small, enchanted vial she had concealed in her palm. "The darkest hour is just before the dawn." Morgana slipped away, her footsteps silent on the earthen floor, and returned to her hidden sanctuary in the woods. The trees seemed to lean in, as if hungry for what would come next. In the center of her magical formation, she uncorked the vial and let the tear drop onto the arrangement of symbols and objects that represented the souls and the fears of the villagers. A ripple of energy emanated from the point of impact, spreading across the circle, its power intensifying with each circle it crossed. The air around her pulsated, tightening as if constrained by invisible walls. Morgana felt as though she were at the center of a vast whirlpool, energy spiraling inward, growing ever denser, ever darker, ever more potent. Her chant rose to a frenzied pitch as she executed the final gestures of the incantation. At the moment of completion, a shockwave of energy burst from the circle, powerful enough to bend the trees and scatter the leaves. Morgana, standing in its epicenter, felt an exhilaration that verged on rapture. Her ritual was near its culmination. Back in the village, a veil of uncertainty had settled over every home, every heart, every soul. The noose tightened, and with each passing day, the villagers moved one step closer to an abyss they couldn't even fathom. Somewhere in their collective conscience, a cracking sound echoed, the sound of a community, a way of life, a moral fabric breaking. Unbeknownst to them, they were also hearing the first reverberations of their world fracturing, preparing to give way to something far darker, far more malevolent, and irrevocably final. The atmosphere in Marrowvale had thickened to a stifling haze of dread. The sun seemed to shy away from the village now, only half illuminating the streets as if loath to fully reveal what was happening below. And in this dim, uncertain light, Morgana stood in the village square. The news had spread like wildfire. Morgana was a witch. Some claimed they had always suspected, others feigned ignorance. But what riveted the villagers' attention was Morgana's counterclaim. She was not just a witch, but a white witch, a savior sent to free them from the evil that plagued them. "It is not I who brings this curse upon you," Morgana spoke, her voice tinged with an ethereal authority that seemed to penetrate every heart. "If you allow me, I can perform a ritual to cleanse this village, to cast out the shadow that has settled over us." Eyes turned toward Father Edmund, who had been a beacon of spirituality, but was now clouded by indecision. "If it's the only way," he muttered, his eyes downcast, "then let God's will be done." Morgana directed the villagers to form a great circle in the square, instructing them to hold hands. The air was thick with the villagers' collective anxiety and desperation. They watched, mesmerized, as Morgana began tracing arcane symbols in the dirt, sprinkling them with a concoction of rare herbs. The symbols seemed to shimmer momentarily, then sank into the earth as if absorbed by its very essence. Thomas, standing beside his mother, felt Morgana's gaze lock onto his. She smiled serenely at him and mouthed, "Thank you." It wasn't till he felt the brush of her thumb against his cheek that he realized he was crying. Tears of hope, of salvation. Morgana deftly caught one on a piece of sacred cloth, folding it carefully before placing it in her pouch. "Concentrate," Morgana commanded the village. "Think of all the goodness, all the love and hope you have. Channel it through your hands, through your hearts." And they did. In that circle, every man, woman, and child poured their fear, their love, their very essence into the ritual, unwittingly turning the wheel of their own damnation. Morgana began to chant. Her voice ascended in timbre and power, becoming an almost otherworldly symphony that rang through the air, through the trees, through the very sky itself. And as her chant reached its crescendo, she opened her pouch and released the captured tear into the circle. For a moment, nothing. Then the earth beneath the circle trembled, subtly, as if shivering. Above, the sky began to darken inexplicably, shifting hues till it settled on a foreboding crimson. The blood moon revealed itself, an eye watching the final moments of a dying world. In the square, the villagers gasped collectively, their faces painted in shades of red by the unsettling moonlight. They felt an indescribable pull in their chests, as though their very souls were being tugged towards some unseen abyss. "The cleansing is done," Morgana declared, her voice exultant yet hollow, like an empty cathedral. "You are free." And for a moment, they believed her. But as the seconds ticked by, the uncomfortable truth settled in their hearts, a truth darker and more dreadful than any they could have imagined. The ritual had done something, yes, but what had it unleashed? Their thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, a guttural growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, like a monstrous creature awakening from a long slumber. The ground shook more violently this time, cracks appearing in the cobblestone streets, the air filled with the scent of sulfur and brimstone. It was as if the very gates of hell were opening, and in that dread-filled instant, every villager knew their final hour had begun. As their eyes met, eyes filled with dawning realization and regret, they understood that Morgana had indeed cleansed them of illusions, of innocence, of hope. What remained was a horrific clarity. They were but cogs in a malevolent design, the opening act of an apocalyptic descent. And it was too late for salvation. Barely had the last tremor faded when the sky above Marrow Vale erupted into chaos. Lightning bolts, the color of rotting flesh, crisscrossed the heavens, colliding with an explosive fury that sent shudders through the ground below. Furious winds howled through the trees, as though voicing the lament of tortured souls. The earth itself seemed to groan in agony, its surface fracturing into jagged cracks that reached like dark tendrils across the village square. Those too near fell screaming into abysses that appeared from nowhere, swallowed whole by the ravenous ground. Panic unfurled its monstrous wings, enveloping the villagers in a frenzied chaos. Friends, family, neighbors, all social contracts were abandoned as each person scrambled in a futile effort to escape an inescapable doom. Doors were barricaded, prayers were shouted over the tumult, and as the gravity of their betrayal sank in, the cries for mercy turned to wails of despair. "God have mercy. What have we done?" Father Edmund fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix so tightly the edges bit into his palms. He had led his flock not to salvation, but to slaughter. In the midst of this pandemonium, Morgana stood solitary and unscathed. As her eyes met those of the villagers, one by one recognizing her, even in their hysteria, a wicked joy danced in her gaze. With a wave of her hand, she transformed. It was as if her flesh were made of smoke and shadow, swirling and reforming into a figure that was no longer human. Towering above them, her form was now an amalgam of darkness and dread, with eyes that glowed like molten lava. Her laughter resonated in a terrible cacophony that reverberated across the open square, full of malice and triumph. "It is done. The season of the witch is upon you, upon the world." Morgana spread her arms wide, as if to embrace the mayhem she had unleashed. Suddenly, a gale of supernatural force blasted from her, flattening everything in its path. Houses crumbled like cards, trees were uprooted, flung into the air like kindling. The villagers were tossed about like mere dolls, their screams of terror drowned out by the demonic winds. The ground beneath the village ruptured with one final, violent upheaval, as if the earth itself were dislodging a rotten tooth. Buildings, people, the entire landscape was consumed in a vortex of darkness and fire. The village of Marrow Vale was no more, reduced to smoldering ashes in a world teetering on the edge of oblivion. From the ruins that once were Marrow Vale, Morgana surveyed her devastation with cold satisfaction. In her true form, imposing yet elegant, she unfurled her wings of night. As she took to the sky, her eyes were drawn to the horizon, beyond which lay countless cities and kingdoms, teeming with souls ripe for harvest. With a smirk that was both cruel and ecstatic, she soared into the approaching storm, leaving behind a world on the brink. Morgana reveled in her newfound freedom, savoring the taste of victory. She had all the time in the world, what was left of it, anyway. The season of the witch had begun, and so too had the unraveling of the world. So ends our grim journey through the shattered remnants of Marrow Vale. Were the seeds of their doom sown by their own mistrust and betrayal, or were they merely pawns in a game orchestrated by an ancient evil? Perhaps we'll never know. What we do know, however, is that the season of the witch is not confined to a single village nor a single moment in time. It lurks in the corners of our world, in the recesses of our minds, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Thank you for daring to venture into the abyss with us tonight on our scary stories. But remember, before you rest your eyes and succumb to the illusions of safety and light, remember Morgana, and ask yourself, what season is it in your world? Sleep well if you can. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.